Welcome to the Concast. I'm former dishwasher, failed musician, and absurdist writer John Conrath. On today's show, we talk to Ray Miller, creator of Metal Curse magazine, the record label Cursed Productions, and the band Adversary. He can be found at metalcurse.com. I remember King Foley eating at that Howard Johnson's that one time. But,
right after the crazy New Jersey Metalfest.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that later. But so I'm here on the mic with Ray Miller, who I think of everybody that I've talked to so far here, you're definitely the person I've known the longest. And do you remember where we met?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, first of all, John. And of course, I remember we met a long time ago, more than 30 years ago, I think, in high school in electronics class, in Mr. Burson's electronics class.
Yeah, I remember 7th hour, I think it was.
7th hour.
Yeah.
Of course, you remember everything.
Yeah, and I think you were a year older than me, but we were in there. I think we both took that class thinking, like, we're going to build some fucking robots and shit, and then we get in there and it's like, okay, if you have this amount of resistance and you add this amount, what is it? You know, it's like, well, fuck this, man.
I was hoping for the robots too, for sure. Yeah,
well, okay, when we met, you were already pretty much a metalhead. I mean, you had more tapes than anybody I knew, and I mean, you were, I can directly credit you for basically making me listen to Metallica. And I mean, I remember like the day that you first played Kill 'Em All for me. I don't even know if you remember that, but
I don't. I assume it was probably in my car, and I was like, "You're listening to this. We're doing it right now."
Yeah, I mean, okay. I'll just say the story real quick. So we had this kind of insane principal or vice principal who was like kind of a Jesus freak and was into like, he would drag kids out of detention and say, if you go to church, you won't get in trouble and all this. So anyway, he organized something on a Saturday. It was like called Super Saturday. Do you remember this at all?
No, I tried to forget as much as I could about that guy so it wouldn't just drive me insane.
Yeah. So, okay. So he had some stupid thing where you go in on a Saturday and everybody goes in and I don't know what, you play dodgeball and talk about your feelings or something stupid like that.
Sure. That sounds right.
And they had a bunch of prizes. And I think either you or Larry, who was also there, was like, oh, there's going to be tons of chicks. We have to go.
Oh, I do remember that now.
And so we went to this thing. And of course, after 3 hours, it was like, why the fuck did we go to school on a Saturday and we're just sitting around doing nothing and nobody's here except for all the people from this guy's church. And
right.
So they were going to serve lunch and it was just going to be frozen pizza or whatever. So we were like, well, fuck this. And we ran, you snuck out to your car and we're driving around and you start playing this tape. And at that time I wasn't, I listened to Twisted Sister. It was probably the heaviest thing I had in my collection. And you were like, oh, you got to check this out. And it was like mind blowing. You're playing Kill 'Em All and you were like, this band is so fucking cool. They can rhyme nothing with nothing in this song. And so then we had to sneak back into this thing to see if we won any prizes. And I ended up winning a gift card.
I was going to say, I thought you won the gift card and then we went over to Super Sound so you could buy something, right?
And I bought 2 tapes. One was the second Queensryche album, which had just come out,
right?
And then the other was that I bought Kill 'Em All. So that started it. So here's the thing that I don't even really know, even though I've known you 30 something years, is that we both grew up in Elkhart, and so some background on that for people that don't know. Elkhart was like 40,000 people, and I guess we had MTV, or you maybe had
eventually.
MTV. But other than that, it was a radio station called U93, which was like, Cyndi Lauper, Men at Work, like all that kind of crap. And that was, or country or religious. Like there was a religious channel called WFRN. I don't know if you remember that.
Sure.
Yep. Which stood for We Fuck Real Nuns.
I wish that's what it stood for.
So yeah, anyways, so there was just, there was a Music Land, there was that place Super Sounds in the mall. But
at the time when even a tiny little mall like the Elkhart one had 2 record stores and another one just down the street at the other tinier little mall.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, how the hell did you get into this stuff? Because, I mean, you don't have like an older brother or whatever that was, getting you into this. I mean, like, what was your first metal band that you got into, and kind of what was your progression going from that to Metallica?
The first metal band that I got into, well, let me back up and say that my dad always really loved music, and he loved, well, still does love, he's still alive, loves shitty music, just terrible stuff. He likes blues, which I listened to a lot when I was a kid, and he likes just weird, just crazy weird country music that, I mean, popular stuff like Willie Nelson or whatever, but stuff that people have never heard of, weird Cajun music, just a lot. I didn't really like any of that, but it did at least let me know that there's more in the world than what you might just hear on, like you said, U93 or whatever.
Yeah.
Those kind of channels were. So when I was a little kid, I don't know, 10 or 12 or something like that, however old I would have been, I was hanging out with my friend Chad, who lived next door to where my dad lived in Mishawaka. And Chad had older brothers. So like you just said, well, you didn't have any older brothers. Yeah. So, but he did. And these guys, one of them had been out to California for a while, and he brought back some crazy stuff. But one of the bands that I really liked was a German band called Accept.
Oh yeah. Balls to the Wall.
Balls to the Wall. Sure. And that just, man, it just totally, like you said about Metallica, it just totally blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, there is a lot more out there than, like you said, than Cyndi Lauper or Men at Work or whatever was just popular at the time. And I've got sort of an obsessive, crazy personality. So once I found out that there was more, I just wanted to keep finding more and, see what other stuff was available. I mean, this was so long before the internet and so long before anything else that anytime I had any money, I would just go to Super Sounds, or I would go to, go to World Records, or go to wherever I could and just maybe buy a random tape. I mean, that was even before CDs. Yeah.
And that was that for those of you who were born past like 1990 or something.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the old days, I don't want to go Andy Rooney on this again, but I mean, it seems like the only music discovery was either like sometimes the people in the stores would know what they were talking about, or, say, hey, you need to listen to this. But it seems like otherwise it was like you just had to dig through the stacks and find either something with like the font on this album is all bloody and weird, or like, oh, this is on Megaforce, so maybe...
Right, I was going to just say.
Maybe it doesn't suck, because I remember that too. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the other memories that I had was driving around on a day when it was like parent-teacher conferences or something. We were driving around South Bend in your car, and we listened to two tapes about 50 times each, and one was Anthrax, Among the Living, and then the other one was that MOD, USA for MOD album.
Yep.
Which were both, I think those are even recorded in the same studio.
I wouldn't doubt that. I wouldn't doubt it. There's a lot of crossover between those bands.
Yeah, but it seems like back then, I mean, that was the only way to kind of ladder up, was to like, listen to, Metallica and then be like, okay, I'm going to go get all these Megadeth tapes, and then I'm going to go from there to whatever else. Yep. And it seems like too, I even forget the names of the guys. I can like picture them in my head, but I don't remember like the guys that worked at World and Super Sounds that used to like say, hey man, you need to listen to Slayer or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Eventually they would start to have some, well, like at Super Sounds, they had, man, I can't remember that. I know the guy you're talking about. There was that one guy, I think his name was Franklin, wasn't it?
Well, there was one guy, there was one guy that was like closer to our age that was named Frank, him. But Frank was kind of, I mean, on the plus side, and I think I mentioned this in another podcast, Frank gave me the first Dream Theater album before it came out. Like they were listening, like I walked in one day and he was listening to a promo of it, and I was like, oh man, this is so cool. and he just like took out the tape and said, "Here you go, it's yours." And that started a huge, problem for me. But right. But Frank also told me to buy the first Winger album. So,
nobody bats 1,000, I guess.
Yeah.
But sure, I remember back then, like you were saying, there weren't a lot of albums on Megaforce. That was always for a bigger label. It always had kind of a small roster. But I do remember once we discovered Combat Records.
Oh, yeah.
We figured, well, we'll just buy any single thing that's on Combat. And a possibly funny story about that is that something probably nobody on earth knows, but the very first Poison album was on Combat. And Larry, our buddy Larry, and I went into this crazy sick bastard we know named Larry. And I went into Super Sounds, and he's like, oh, here's some new shit that's on Combat. Oh man, it's a band with all girls. he thought they were girls, right? Because if you look at the cover of that, they got all makeup on, and he wasn't paying that much attention. He just saw Combat, and I think he got that and maybe like the first Death album at the same time, probably very much confusing whoever was ringing him up. And I remember we listened to it on the way back to his house, and we're like, man, this is really shitty. I mean, I guess at least they're girls. They're trying to play hard rock, I guess. I don't even know what to call it. It's terrible. And eventually it starts dawning on us what they're saying. And they're like, they're not girls. Larry took that tape and broke it in half and threw it out the window of my car and hung on to the tape so it would just trail tape for 50 feet or whatever.
Yeah, that's another thing I think the kids will miss is take the joy of taking a cassette and winging it out the window and
man,
making a 2-mile long trail of 1/8 inch wide tape or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So this was all in the late 80s, and I remember pretty much around the turn of the decade, I went off to school in Bloomington for a year, and you were actually there for part of it. We won't get into the details of that, but but I remember you went back to Elkhart, South Bend.
Genius move on my part.
Yeah, but I remember, and I don't remember exactly where it was or like what time it was, but I remember at some point you were like, "Hey man, I'm starting a magazine," and right. I was like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" And you were like, "Yeah, I'm starting a magazine," because even at that time, I don't even know that I ever saw a zine. Like I might have seen like an art zine or something, and I know right. I saw like the free newspapers, like the Bloomington Voice or stuff like that, but I had like really no idea what you were talking about. And I'm trying to figure out when exactly this was, or when I'm talking about Metal Curse, which is long running zine that you started, and when exactly did that start? And I guess what was your idea going into that?
Well, the first issue was published in January 1990.
Okay.
And I'm not even sure how I remember that. If you said when was the second issue published, I don't think I could remember.
I actually know that because I've got a stack of them in front of me here, of all of the originals, and because I was looking at them before we got started.
Well, once we're done with this, I need the publication dates for all the rest of them.
Well, the only one that I know for sure is that on the cover of number 2, you said June 1990.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So, yeah, I mean, I had initially wanted to publish them a lot more frequently than it ever happened. But how it worked out is when I was in Bloomington, there was, man, I do not remember the name of the record store that was in Bloomington, but it was just all crazy punk bands and super unknown type of stuff.
They had there were a few good record stores there. I mean, there was a Karma, which they had some demos and stuff, but yeah, there were a couple of other ones, and I don't even remember the names either.
Well, one of them, probably all of them, but one of them in particular just had a bunch of free zines that were just photocopied zines that were, I think, maybe right when you walk in the door. If I remember right, you'd walk in and there was a second door that you'd go through. So there was just a little space there where they had flyers for shows and some free zines and stuff like that. And I probably took every one of those that ever existed to just have something to read, and just got the idea that there was just a lot of shit in the world that I didn't know about, and that this was a good way to find out about it. Once again, way before the internet, way before any kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
And once the Bloomington experiment was over for me, and I got back to Elkhart, Larry and I were hanging out, and we noticed that on, I'm trying to think, I think it was a Sepultura cassette, probably Beneath the Remains, maybe.
Yeah.
The Roadrunner, the first Roadrunner re-release for that, it had initially been on a different label, probably from Brazil, I'd imagine. There was a phone number for Roadrunner on there, and we just, once again, no internet, no way to find out anything in the world about anything. So I just called Roadrunner from Larry's house, and I guess they figured that anybody who would call them to just ask them some questions must be published in some kind of zine. So I said, yeah. And in the background, Larry's like, what the fuck are they telling you, man? What the fuck's going on? You tell me some shit. What the fuck's happening? And I was like, dude, stop cursing at me. And, I'm on the phone or whatever stupid thing I said, but whoever I was talking to heard me say curse. And I was like, oh, yeah. The name of the zine's Metal Curse. And it was just a weird thing like that. It wasn't anything that we had planned.
Nice.
And so a few days later, and I gave him my address, and I happened to have a P.O. box, and I gave him the P.O. box address, and a few days later, a giant package showed up with, I don't know, 24 cassettes probably. I mean, it was like Evil Christmas or something.
Nice.
And we just got started reviewing all those and trying to reach out to more and more underground bands and bands that weren't signed and bands that were recording their own music, not for a record label. So we would get the demo tapes from those bands. It was all tapes back then, and then do tape trades with other people. I did a lot of tape trading back in the day. And once again, for people who don't understand what that means, I would literally make a copy of a cassette of whatever demo, or whatever the case may be, and just send it to somebody else, and they would send me whatever they had done.
Yeah. And that's something I talked about this on another podcast, but I think, you were definitely the person that got me started in this. It seems like, or it's true, they had almost like this underground economy for, and it was the tape traders, but it was also, it was funny because it seems like everybody at that point was either in a band, was a tape trader, ran like a distro company,
for sure,
resold tapes, or did a zine, or some combination of those four things. Yeah. It seemed like anytime you wrote somebody or they wrote you, there was two things. One was the flyers. Yes, the flyers for sure. And do you want to explain what a flyer is? Oh, right. I keep forgetting. Nobody knows what a flyer is. People barely know what email is anymore with, Twitter and everything else. Yeah, that's true. So we would make just a simple little flyer that would be small enough to fit into an envelope. But you'd make a little sheet of paper that would fit into an envelope without you needing to fold that little sheet of paper. And it would have, it would say Metal Curse, issue 3, available now. Send me $5, you sons of bitches, or whatever. And then it would have the address on there. And then it would say maybe, we'll trade for other zines, or send me some shit to review, or whatever the crazy stuff, and maybe possibly some kind of little artwork, or just a little scratchy drawing of a skull or some stupid shit. Skull, exactly, yeah. Yeah, 666 skulls on there, probably in the background. And then you'd send just as many of those as you could afford. So you wouldn't just put one in each envelope. You'd put a bunch of them, because you would have gotten a bunch of different ones from everybody else you got mail from. And I used to get a ton of mail. So
you'd put a few of your own flyers in there, and always the etiquette was to put a bunch of everybody else's flyers that were at least equal to the amount of your own flyers that you put in.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember there was, and I'm sure you were explained this to me, painfully a million times, but when I started working on the zine or was helping you with doing mail, I mean, you had basically like a fucking room full of flyers.
I did.
One of the other things that happened was everybody would get one of those little inked return stamps that you put in the corner.
Definitely. I have 3 of them.
Metal Curse, P.O. Box 302. And everybody would stamp the back of everybody else's flyers. So like,
for sure.
If you got a flyer from Rotting Christ, which, oh my God, there was...
Which you did. The first time I ever heard of Rotting Christ was actually at your apartment in Bloomington, and I was looking through a stack of your flyers, and I saw it, and I was like, oh fuck. Best $7 I ever spent in my whole life.
Yeah. And theirs were too. I mean, like there was like this disparity of like, oh, here's a flyer from Metalcore Zine, and it was just like the worst Xerox machine possible. It was done on a typewriter.
Yeah. We love you, Chris Forbes, though, if you're listening to this.
Yeah, I've met him before. He's pretty awesome. But
cool.
But then like compared to that, like the Rotting Christ one was like,
yes,
it's like fucking silk screen, 4 colors, professional.
Nice.
H.R. Giger did the artwork on it, But
man, almost.
But anyway, so the thing that I remember was when you got somebody else's flyer, you stamped it with your stamp, and then it went back out. So like you would get a flyer from Rotting Christ, you'd flip it over,
and there'd be a bunch of stamps on the back. Yeah, and you could kind of see the trail of where it had been on the way to arrive to you, which I always thought was interesting.
And speaking of stamps, I think the statute of limitations is out on this, so we can talk about it.
Uh-oh.
Can you explain the save my stamps?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, this was something that I never did. And
of course.
I'm not just saying that because it's illegal. I actually didn't do this. But I mean, I would send people back their stamps. So you'd get a letter from somebody, or you'd get a tape from somebody, or later you'd get a CD from somebody, or a 7-inch, vinyl record, or whatever the case may be. And one thing that people did is they would put glue, just a thin layer of, let's say, Elmer's glue, which dries clear, on top of the stamps. So then when those stamps were canceled, and you would just cut this, so the stamps would be canceled and they'd have that cancellation on there, but it'd be on the glue. So you'd cut those stamps out and mail them back to the person along with whatever your trade was. So let's say they sent me a CD to review or a cassette to review or whatever. Then when I sent them a copy of the zine back with their review in it, I'd stick those stamps in there. Or if it were just a tape trade or whatever, I'd stick the stamps back in there. And then they could just take a little damp sponge or something and wipe that glue off, which would, of course, wipe off the postmark. And then they would reuse those stamps.
Yeah. And I remember I think it was a bigger deal for European bands because it costs so much. I mean, we said then stuff costs so much to mail. I mean, now it's absolutely ridiculous, but
yeah, don't even get me started. It's almost $13 to send one CD to Europe now.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And people wonder why downloads are a big deal, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah. So, so you started, I guess you said in January, and I'm flipping through these issues. And the first 2 are, well, first of all, issue 1 was 12 pages long.
Sure.
Just a photocopied stack with 3 staples on the sides. And then number 2 was a little bit longer. It was 16 pages.
Yeah, I should have stuck with 16 pages.
Yeah, but then you were starting to get... you were starting to get a few more interviews at that point. Mm-hmm. You have a big article about censorship, which was kind of, fuck the PMRC kind of stuff, which was also a big thing back then. But then I seem to remember, so that was like in the summer of 90. And then I came back to Elkhart and went to school in South Bend for a year. And from what I remember is I never went to classes that year. I think the fall I did okay. And I think in the spring, my GPA was like a 0.68 because I just never went to anything. And, but what we were doing was like, I remember hanging out with you a ton then.
Mm-hmm.
And just listening to like, oh, check out this band, Broken Hope or whatever.
Sure.
Or this band Nocturnus is so sick.
Yeah.
And, listening to all of that stuff. But then also just kind of scheming of like, how can we make this scene bigger? And that's like how you kind of dragged me in and to help you with doing some of the mail and the reviews and stuff.
Yeah.
But do you also remember what the big thing in Metal Curse? I think it was it in Metal Curse 3 or 4? It was in 4.
It was in 4. Was that the first issue with Dear Death?
Yes.
Yeah. So what happened there was I had to print everything out. It was just way, way, way before you could send a printer any kind of electronic files. I mean, like a professional printer. And I just had a little dot matrix printer. And so I would print out everything on that and then literally cut things apart and paste them up on the page for photocopying. And you had this idea that, and I don't really remember where you got the idea for Dear Death, but it was sort of a column, I guess, that you did, or a page you did for me, where you would write in fake letters and then, I hope I just didn't give away the secret there. You'd write in fake letters and then have super hilarious responses to those letters. So somebody would write in, Dear Death, my dog doesn't like it when I stick my thumb up its ass. What should I do? And then you'd say, well, are you stroking its balls enough when you do that? Or whatever crazy thing you'd say. And it was always way funnier than that. You always had the funniest shit.
Yeah, and
everybody really loved it.
And just in case Sarah McLaughlin is listening, I didn't actually write anything about it.
No. We all like animals more than people, I'm sure. So we would never...
More like about how to store a severed head, or
everybody likes their head different.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway,
yes, I still remember that one. So the first one you did, you printed out on the laser printer at the school at IUSB, which is the South Bend campus of Indiana University. For those wondering if the IU part is Iowa or something, and I couldn't believe how good that printout looked, and it looked so much better than the rest of everything else that I did that I had to go get a laser printer, which certainly helped out for a few issues after that until I decided I need to just do everything a totally different way.
Yeah, and I think I actually don't have a copy of number 3 here, or I don't have it where I was looking. I might have it in storage somewhere, but I'm looking at number 4, and that's when Dear Death came in, and obviously you were kind of scanning these logos of all the bands.
Yeah, that took a long time.
And putting them in there. But this was also you moved to like an offset printer.
Yep.
Where it was actually stapled in the middle, and it was like a longer thing, and you had a real ad on the back from Earache Records, and you did, there were more interviews and there was an interview with Sepultura, which at that time was a really big deal.
Yep, that was a good one.
They were actually looking at this now. I mean, you interviewed, or I guess this was Pete, interviewed Sadis, and they interviewed Obituary. So, I mean, these are, in 90, I guess this would have been in 91. I mean, that was some pretty big names for the death metal scene or the, thrash.
Sure.
Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, I tried.
Yeah. So, from what I remember is like it's slowly, you got more stuff in, you were getting more mail. I guess the underground network kind of built up, and I guess it's fair to say like the peak or a peak of death metal was probably around 92 or so. Because just looking at like issues 5 and 6,
Mm-hmm.
I guess there was more thrash and stuff then of like, or grindcore or whatever, Napalm Death and, Cyclone Temple. I don't know if you consider them thrash or,
absolutely.
But, then it slowly moved into death metal. And this was also, because I started a zine called Zenocide, and it was mostly I needed to get free shit too. And I was back in Bloomington, so I couldn't glom off of all of your free tapes.
Let me say something real quick about Zenocide. I've been thinking about this the last few days since we're, talking about doing this podcast. And I always thought that Zenocide was the absolutely best name ever for this kind of zine. I just thought it was the greatest thing I ever heard until I don't remember where we were, but I heard somebody else who wasn't one of us try to pronounce it. And I realized, oh no, nobody knows how to say it and nobody knows what it means. It was too good. It was just too clever for its own good. It was just too much for everybody. But I always did think that was the perfect name right up until I found out it was too perfect.
Yeah, and right up to the point where we found out that Orson Scott Card was kind of an asshole. But
well, that too. That sure, but I mean,
yeah. So I think like but right at that point was like kind of peak death metal, because this was
probably
you had all of the death metal stuff was just huge at that point. I mean, just thinking about like all the, when you say mainstream bands, it's kind of like, it's not mainstream. I mean, in the grand scheme of what was going on in music at that time, Earache Records was like a drop in the sea. I mean, compared to, whatever.
I should have done a little research on this because I don't remember the exact year, but Morbid Angel, which was an early death metal band, had an album on Giant Records, which is a subsidiary of one of the biggest major labels. I mean, I think that it was the same. Man, I really should have checked this before I didn't even think of it until just now. But I mean, that's like the same label as, I forget who it was, like maybe the Backstreet Boys or some crazy shit like that. Now, of course, they got dropped right away because they didn't sell 1 million copies. But somebody looked at Morbid Angel and was like, "Ooh, yeah, let's sign them. That's going to be important." And I think that really what happened that fucked them, as much as anything else, is that one of their videos was on Beavis and Butthead, and Beavis and Butthead really mercilessly made fun of it, if you remember that.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you the exact lineage of why those decisions happened, because it was also, Earache, and at the time we thought Earache was just the biggest thing ever, and really it was two guys in a office about as big as my bathroom, and
right.
Just they did have distribution where they would get into kind of the second tier. They wouldn't get into like a Music Land, but they would get into like a Camelot or Super Sounds or whatever.
They did get into Music Land eventually once Earache made the deal with Relativity Records, which was distributed by Caroline at the time. How I know that, and I don't know when the third issue of my own magazine was published, is a little embarrassing, but once they had the deal with Relativity, then Earache was all over the place. I mean, you could get Earache Records at Best Buy at some point in time.
Yeah, and I guess what I was going to say is, I personally, my conspiracy theory on it is the Metallica Black Album, because when that came out in 91, and it didn't really get big until 92, but I think when that happened, like every big record label that didn't know anything about metal was like, yeah, we need a Metallica, And
sure.
And so they were like, okay, was this Morbid Angel somebody that we could kind of water down a little bit and get to become a Metallica? And like the same thing with Entombed and Carcass and, a lot of other bands.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, I'm sure that they talked to the guys at risk of the guys in Morbid Angel just trying to find me and kick my ass or whatever. I'm sure that they talked to those guys, and Morbid Angel's singer at the time was David Vincent. I'm sure they talked to David, and he was like, yeah, we can work with you guys, considering everything that he's done since then. And he's in a country band now, John. I don't know if you even know that.
Nice.
So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not trying to question that guy's integrity, but I feel as if of a lot of the bands they could have gone to and said, hey, can you work with us a little bit on your sound to make it a little bit more palatable to a mainstream or a more mainstream audience? I think anybody who knows what they're talking about could probably see why they might have gone with Morbid Angel. Plus, they were arguably the most well-known of those type of bands, of death metal bands at the time.
Yeah.
Although the press release they put out for whichever album that was hilarious, because they said, oh, the very first death metal band, the very first black metal band, the very first every kind of band, it was all Morbid Angel. And it was just everybody took a shit on that press release and that album.
Yeah.
I forget if that was, man, I wish I could remember. I'm just not sure.
I think it was Covenant, wasn't it?
Was it Covenant? It was the video that Beavis and Butthead made fun of was for Where the Slime Live, I think, if I remember, because it had that crazy like underwater vocal effect.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seemed like that was kind of the beginning of the end of that wave.
Yeah, it got too big for its own good, I think. And then and I mean, you could say the same thing about a lot of the other bands when they did, Relativity Records got hooked up with Sony, if you remember. Yeah. And so, or maybe it was even the Columbia branch of Sony, if I remember. I may not be remembering that right. And so there was kind of a wave of albums that were all just not as good around that time. There was a bad Carcass album where they were just really toned down. And, man, I don't even remember all the rest of them, but there was just kind of a bad wave of albums right there. Coincidentally, right after Earache had that deal, where they were on a, distributed by or manufactured by or whatever, a much larger label.
Yeah, I personally like that Carcass album, but it compared to, I mean, there was that peak. I mean, it was the same with Cathedral was the same way.
Right, Cathedral, yeah.
So to kind of sidestep a little bit here,
sure.
Aside from being a publisher, I know you also, I think we mentioned there's like those 4 things that everybody was.
Yeah.
And one of the other ones was musician.
Yeah.
So, I was around for the very beginning of your attempts to start a band.
Yeah.
Which was, I know you fiddled around with guitar for a little bit and then got really into bass. And I remember your first band, which was Nuclear Winter.
Yeah, of course you remember that.
I mean, I was around for a lot of that.
You were very, very important, very integral to that mess.
Yeah.
And they were terrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I guess my best revenge here is I could throw one of the songs at the end of this podcast. But
oh yeah, you probably don't want to do that.
Yeah,
those are all really bad songs. But it did sort of put me on a path to just trying to do something artistic, I guess, something musically artistic.
Yeah, and you started the band that you was a lot bigger than, or that had more releases or whatever, was Adversary.
Mm-hmm.
And when did Adversary start? Because I think I was in college, or I was away in Bloomington when you were first getting that going. But what was the story of the genesis of that whole thing?
Well, it's slightly like Xenocide. I thought that Adversary was just a great name, like I thought that Xenocide was a great name. And it turns out that a lot of people have trouble pronouncing it, and it was just a little bit too, I hate to say a little too clever. I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm Mr. Smarty Pants. I'm not. But it was just, people didn't get it. They just didn't get it. I think 3 people in the history of the world ever really understood what that was supposed to be about. But I just had an idea that there were certain kind of sounds that I could sort of put together to try to make something interesting out of those. So, there's a European band called Asphyx that I really like, or Cyanide from Chicago, Deceased, another American band, and just a lot of kind of somewhat slower paced death metal bands. And I liked the idea of, how do I want to phrase that? I liked the idea of just maybe combining some different elements. There was a time when things were really, really very clear cut, and this death metal band would not have any thrashy riffs, typically, or would not have any black metal influence. And there were just a few bands that did. There was another band, and I forget right now where they were from, called Ancient Wisdom, that kind of combined everything together. And I just thought that was just a really super cool idea, and that you wouldn't have to be, I hate to say limited, you wouldn't have to be limited, I guess I'll say it like that, to just any one style.
Yeah. I mean, it's true that, especially at the apex of all of this, 92, 93, 94, that bands became, death metal, capital D, bands became very kind of commoditized, where it was, you got Scott Burns to, do the album for you, and you got, what was that guy's name that did all the covers?
Dan Seagrave
to, paint some wizard or some picture of some kind of satanic beast or whatever.
Something. He did a lot of like weird landscapes and stuff. Yeah, like just crazy
castles on top of a mountain or whatever.
Yeah, or whatever that thing was that he did for Entombed. I don't even know what that was for their second album, but it's the coolest thing I ever saw.
Yeah, but it seemed like, though,
I guess.
And this was kind of, I mean, I kind of like got lax on death metal around 90, 94, 93 or whatever. But that's when I stopped doing Xenocide. But it did seem like a lot of bands at that time were following a formula a little too much.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things with Adversary, once you guys got going, was, I don't know if you'd say doom metal, but I mean, there was definitely...
we were doomy for sure.
Yeah. It wasn't that you were a doom band. You weren't like St. Vitus or something like that.
No, but we had a strong element, though.
Yeah, there were elements of that, and you had, worked in some samples, and I guess you had a little more keyboard oriented, but not in a bad way. And
well, that was one thing that was kind of tricky, because at the time there was a very strong idea that death metal bands just should not have keyboards or any kind of atmospherics like that. And even some samples were kind of, you could go overboard with the samples pretty quick, and people wouldn't like that. And there was a band from Florida called Nocturnus.
Yeah.
And they kind of broke out of that mold. They said, hey, King Diamond has keyboards, we're going to have some. And they had a full-time keyboardist. And their first album, The Key, was fantastic, man. It was amazing. It was like, at the time, it was kind of revolutionary, because it did combine some other things like that, and had these crazy it had keyboard solos. They were going nuts.
Yeah.
And it was really, really, really good. So yeah, I guess that was definitely an influence, or at least it let me think, well, we could do a little more that way too. We also could not find a live drummer.
Oh yeah. So I forgot about this.
We couldn't find a live drummer to save our lives. So my friend Ed said, well, okay, I could do some drum programming. And so he handled the drum programming and the keyboards, and I had just met the guitarist, name's Jack Bodis, and I had just met Jack at the time. I worked at a record store at the time, and if I even remember how I met him, he just was one of those guys where he'd come into the record store, and I'd say, oh, good, it's this dude. Okay. Oh, life is going to not be shitty for 5 minutes while this guy's in here. This is awesome.
Yeah.
And so, just struck up a friendship with him, and he said he played guitar, and I was like, okay, well, let's give this guy a try. And we came together, to form the band, and it just worked out. Jack, super cool, super easy to get along with, and super, super good guitarist. And I don't mean that in like a Steve Vai kind of way.
Yeah.
I mean, like when we'd get together to write songs, he would just, I don't know how to even explain it, because I never had to explain it. I would just show him something I was working on, or a riff or whatever. He wouldn't need a lot of explanation. He would just instantly get that, whatever it was. He would just always get it. And most of the time he'd say, well, what if we tweak it a little bit? What if we do it like that or like this or just a little slower or a little faster or just like that? And every suggestion he ever made was the greatest suggestion I ever heard. I was like, oh, shit, man. He could take something that was pretty good and make it a lot better, just listening to it one time and offering a suggestion. He was really good at that. And unfortunately, in the years between then and now, he's developed carpal tunnel and can't play guitar anymore.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it sucks pretty bad. So, yeah, so we got together and we recorded a couple demos just here in the back room of my house, in between being too loud and having the police called on us a bunch of times.
Yeah.
And then eventually, and we played a bunch of shows, and we played shows in Chicago and all over the place. And thanks, Big Daryl, for setting up those shows for us. Rest in peace, brother.
Yeah.
He's been gone a long time now.
The Thirsty Whale.
Yeah, the Thirsty Whale. Thirsty Whale, we got to play on the same stage as Motorhead, same stage as a lot of other bands, but I felt good all the times I could step up to that mic and thought, let me spit on this mic. He spit right on this fucking thing. So that was cool. So we recorded our first album. We recorded our first demo, I think, in probably late 93 or something, and then another demo in 94. And it took us a while to get to have enough songs, I guess, for the first album. And we really practiced a lot and went into Sheffield studio in, I forget if that's in Hammond or if that's technically in Gary, Indiana.
It's the region. The
region. Yeah, it's in the region. We went there to record our first album, The Winter's Harvest. And it was a really weird experience to record it, but it was really cool. I probably had the hardest time of any of the guys. I mean, Ed had everything sequenced for that. Now, when we played live, he would play all the keyboards live. Obviously, the drums were sequenced, but he would play the keyboards live, and he rocked the fuck out of that keyboard, man. I know that sounds crazy, but he would really get into it, and he was literally rocking the stand, and I mean, he would go nuts. He went more crazy than anybody. And is it teasing somebody if it's a positive thing?
No.
So we would tease Jack about being Mr. One Take because he never needed more than one take for anything. Say, Jack, play that song, and he'd play through it, and he'd perfectly. He never made a mistake on any of the songs ever. He never needed a second take.
Yeah.
Except for one song, which there's each one of us has a song on the first album that's just Jack wrote one. Well, we mixed up the writing, but Jack wrote one song that's just him playing an acoustic guitar, and there's one that's Ed that's just all kind of ambient keyboard stuff.
It's like there's Ipecac something or
Ipecac Pool.
Yeah,
and then I have another one that's an instrumental, but it sounds like, it's the death metal song, and it sounds like the rest of them, but it's an instrumental. It's got some, I would think, nice samples in it. And Jack's song was called Obsessed. And dude, we loved it. He played it all the time, practiced it a million times. And when we got to Sheffield to record it, Sheffield just had some kind of a problem with Jack's acoustic guitar. And it just wasn't sounding right. It just didn't sound, I forget what the problem was, but it just wasn't working out. And they had a really expensive acoustic there. And I don't even remember what kind it was.
Like a Martin or something like that.
I was going to say that, but it had a round back instead of a flat back.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And Jack could not figure out how to hold this fucking thing. He'd never played a guitar like that before, and it kept sliding around and moving. He had to do so many takes of that song, and I'm not making fun of him. I could have not done it at all. He had to do so many takes of that song before we got a good one that Ed and I just went and left and got something to eat, which there was an amazing, amazing restaurant right next door to them, or right, maybe it wasn't next door, but it was just right there. And we went and got something to eat and just walked around for a minute to just give Jack some space. And we came back and he was still trying to get a good take. That damn guitar.
So I was just going to say, you guys did what was it, 2 full-length albums and
Yes.
then an EP, and you did a demo too, or that you like re-released.
Yeah. Actually, the first demo got re-released on Wild Rags Records. It was Wild Rags 100.
Nice.
So I always liked that. I always liked Richard C., the guy who did Wild Rags. He was cool.
Richard C. was an interesting institution, I guess. Just for the background on it, there were a lot of, this guy Richard C., he actually ran like a clothing store.
He did. Like, that's where the name Wild Rags came from. It was just like kind of weird rock and roll clothing, really flamboyant.
And I don't remember how much older he was, but he was like older.
He was older, yeah.
Like, I mean, I felt like he was as old as our dads or something, but I mean...
he's probably younger than we are now.
Yeah, that's the sad thing. But Richard C. was like a really big point of contention for a lot of people said, he's a ripoff, man. Yep. And...
well, that's one thing that I can't explain. I think that Richard C., although he did eventually go to prison, I think, for tax evasion.
Yeah.
But he tried to, as an aside, I mentioned the band Deceased a little while ago, and I think that King Foley, Deceased singer and drummer, was on the phone with Richard C. when the police or the feds or whoever broke in and took him away. He was talking to him on the phone at the time, according to King.
Nice.
So I think that what would happen is that Richard C. would talk to these bands and make a deal with them. And when we made our deal with him, I signed an actual contract. A lot of times the deals you'd make with bands were just basically a handshake deal. But we signed an actual contract with him. And I think that what would happen is bands would have ridiculous expectations about things that were not in their contract. And I would have to deal with that later. And I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute too. But bands would just have crazy expectations about things. And then when Richard would tell them, no, a world tour is not in your contract. No T-shirt. I'm not printing up any T-shirts. That wasn't in your contract. Or whatever the case would be. And he would just go by the letter of the contract, and they would just expect more because they think they signed with Wild Rags and now they're Metallica or whatever.
Yeah.
They just had these crazy expectations and just were not in line with reality. And they'd be like, Richard C. ripped me off. Well, I can tell you, Richard C. never ripped me off. And he was always super, super cool to me. Super nice guy. I don't know. I would not have any bad things to say about him. And I know a hell of a lot of people who do have a lot of bad things to say about him. So I don't know. Maybe he treated me differently. I don't know. I
had basically 2 experiences with Richard C. And one, we can get into something else with this, but one was, so I was writing him, or I might have called him or something, and we decided to do a trade where I would send him 10 zines or 20 zines or something, and he would send me, whatever. And it was kind of lopsided because
3 cassettes. It was always lopsided with him. He always wanted to get the best deal, but he would negotiate. People wouldn't realize that he'd negotiate, so he'd start out by saying, send me 20 zines and I'll send you 5 cassettes. And you'd have to be like, dude, that's a shitty trade. And then he'd be like, well, I could go 6 cassettes. And you'd be like, come on, man, and how about 15 zines or whatever? And he'd meet you in the middle if you worked with him a little bit, and if you didn't feel like working with him, then fuck you. He'll just take whatever the first offer was. Then that's better for him.
Yeah. Well, what happened here was we did a zine for zine trade, right?
Oh, okay, cool.
And which is kind of a little stilted because his quote unquote zine was really his catalog with like a few articles in it. But anyway, so I
loved that catalog, man.
So I got one of those full, like a padded envelope or whatever, and put a bunch of zines in it, mailed it off, priority mail.
Sure.
About a week and a half later, it comes back and it was returned to sender. And, the address was right, but it was like, refused by, recipient or whatever. And I was so pissed off. I was like, this fucking cocksucker is a ripoff. And, I was just like so pissed off about it. And I just like threw the package in my package of mail and whatever. And like a week later, I was like, okay, I'm out of zines.
I know the story.
Yeah. So I cracked the envelope open and it was copies of his zine that he
of course,
that he like steamed open the package, took my zines out, put his zines in, wrote return to sender, gave it back to the post office, and basically got free postage. So it's like,
that is a Richard C. story right there for sure.
So
that's how he would do it.
So the other story was, I mean, I met him once, and this was at the Milwaukee Metalfest.
Metalfest, yeah.
So to go into this, well, first...
Is this the same story I was going to tell about meeting him at the Metalfest?
Well, we'll see. I think... Okay, to back up for a second, and this is a big going off to the side here. So you initially got me started with, there was a thing called Rock Out Censorship.
Oh, yeah.
The Rock, ROC. Not to be confused with Dwayne Johnson, but...
No, slightly different thing.
Yeah. So I don't know how you met John Woods, the guy that ran that. Probably just from mail.
I think just from mail. I think I probably got one of his flyers, or maybe I don't know. Maybe he had read a copy. Maybe he'd seen a copy of Metal Curse someplace. And I would always ask bands. One of my standard questions was, "Have you had to deal with any type of censorship?" And you'd think really small bands at that level wouldn't have ever had to deal with that, but it turns out that was kind of a problem sometimes.
Yeah.
So I don't really remember how I met Woods, but it was probably through the mail like that. I mean, I'm sure that it was either that he read that and thought, oh, this guy at least knows that censorship is an issue, or maybe I saw one of his flyers and just wrote to him and said, like, Tipper Gore's a bitch, or whatever crazy thing I said.
Yeah. So, okay, so I was writing him, or, and I would call him and stuff. And it was interesting because, I mean, John Woods was just a crazy guy.
He was.
I mean, one is he
really liked him, but man, he was nuts.
He was older than us, and I don't know how much older, but I don't know how much of his backstory you really knew, but because he was originally involved in the Vietnam draft resistance movement. Mm-hmm. And he actually fled the country and moved to Sweden for a few years.
Dude, if I ever moved to Sweden, I don't think I'd come back.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how that worked, or how he seemed like the last guy you would think would be speaking Swedish and hanging out in Stockholm or whatever. But
I either didn't know that or I'd forgotten that.
But he was involved with that, and then he was also involved with because he was like from the part of Ohio that was like almost West Virginia.
Right.
So he was involved with like the coal mining labor movement.
Okay.
Because I don't know if he used to work in the mines or not, or he had family that did, but he was involved with like the, striking and negotiations and all that stuff. So, and I don't know how he got into music stuff, but obviously he was really into that. And into the PMRC, against the PMRC, and, getting petitions. And he did this newspaper. I forget what the name of the newspaper itself was, but he was interesting because he worked with all these like underground bands and people like us. But he worked with like a lot of really big names too. And not only in metal. I mean, he was like hanging out with like Snoop Dogg and like the guys in Run DMC or NWA or whatever. And he was into like, he knew Ozzy, and he knew, hung out with all these other, and also record stuff. I mean, to spoiler alert. I mean, he passed away, I don't know, a few years ago. And just like reading
more than a few, I think, but yeah.
Yeah, it was like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. But but the obituaries and all the tributes that came out, I mean, it was like a lot of, like the guy that runs the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I forget what his name, Dave Marsh, was like a friend of his. And I think Dave actually wrote articles for The Rock.
Wow.
And, he wrote a big obituary that I think was like in the New York Times or something. I mean, he was like kind of a big deal. But we used to talk to him all the time. And I used to write articles for The Rock. I wrote a couple of them, and it's funny because I wrote an article about video game violence, and it was around the time of, what was that one fighting game that came out on the Sega that had blood? Was it Mortal Kombat?
Yeah, that probably was the one. I'd imagine that there were some upset moms,
Yeah, and they were talking
that time or whatever.
That was like they were talking about putting ratings on video games and all that.
Yeah.
And so, I wrote an article about it and I put it out there, and it's out on the internet somewhere. I advise you not to read it because it probably sucks. But it's funny because that article has ended up in a couple of university coursework packets.
Really? Wow, that's cool.
So, like somebody at IU ran a program that was like about, like a video game class or something. And it was in the reading of that, which then it ended up in a couple other places and it got cited in a couple of, dissertations or whatever. So that's like my weird claim to fame. But
now I do want to read it.
So there were two, I'm going on so many different branches here. So there was a summer that I was home in 93.
Yeah.
And one, I remember we went to a shit ton of shows that summer.
Yep.
And
we missed one, if that's the same time I'm thinking of.
Yeah. So what I remember is, so Woods was always like, he would sometimes swindle press passes for us or whatever, but he was like, hey, you guys are close to Peoria, right?
Peoria, Illinois, for people listening in, which we're not at all close to. It had to be 200 miles away.
It was further than that.
I don't know. It was 250. I don't know. It was far.
Because we were about 2.5 hours from Chicago, and Peoria was like a couple hours from Chicago. So So he was like, "Yeah, man, I can get you passes to go to this Poison show."
Mm-hmm.
And going back to what you said earlier, Poison was not exactly in our wheelhouse.
No, it wasn't. However.
And by 93, they were probably, I don't know the history of Poison, but I'm guessing that, Nirvana had already hit by then, so they were probably in their free fall.
Probably, but they were still playing at a big arena, whatever that was. I don't know.
And of course our thing was like, oh man, there's going to be chicks all over the place, and we'll have backstage passes.
Yeah, to keep it somewhat less gross for our wives who may listen to this at some point in time, we thought if nothing else, we'd be able to just sell those backstage passes to somebody for a ton of money.
Yeah, that wasn't the conversation on the drive out there, but
no, not at all.
So from what I remember, I think it was like a Sunday night too.
God damn it.
So we drove 4.5, 5 hours dragging all these petitions and all this shit.
All this shit for Rock Out Censorship, all the stuff.
And we get there and we pull up, and I don't remember who it was, but in my mind, the story is that we pulled up and they were like, tonight, Spyro Gyra, or just like...
yeah, it was some bullshit. It was just something totally different. I was like, oh, dude, no.
It was like fucking Kenny Loggins or something. It was just like, it was not Poison. And so I even remember we pulled up to the gate, asked the dude, is this where Poison is? And he's like, dude, that was last night.
Yeah.
So there we were and
this was before cell phones and before anything like that. So we couldn't just call Woods and say, motherfucker, you fucked us on this deal. We're going to kill you, or whatever crazy thing we might have said. We couldn't do anything except just take all of our million flyers and whatever other shit he had sent us to go. I forget, were we supposed to have like a little booth there or something, or were we just supposed to walk around and hand flyers to people?
I don't even remember, but I
think we were supposed to have like a little table or something even.
Yeah, I think the deal was we were supposed to have a table, and I don't think we had t-shirts to sell or anything, but so that kind of brings us to though so the big show that summer was the Milwaukee Metalfest. And back in the day, back in the day, they would have 2 nights, I think.
Eventually they did. it started small, but by this time they had 2 nights for sure.
Actually, I don't even know if they had 2 nights at that point, but I think they had, I know they had all the different stages. Yeah. Like they had at least 3 stages.
That might have been one of the last years they didn't have 2 nights, but I don't know.
I remember, first of all, Woods had to come out and he was in Ohio. We were in Elkhart.
Yeah.
We had to meet up with him. Neither of us knew who the other looked like, and neither of us had, cell phones were not in play at this point in time.
Yeah.
So it was just like some crazy shit. Like you were going to meet him at this mall in South Bend. And it was also like, it was pre-GPS or whatever. So it's like he could have shown up at 3, it could have been 4, he didn't know what time. And I remember I was in Elkhart because the deal was you were in South Bend, which is, whatever, half an hour away.
Yeah.
And you were going to meet him. And then you guys were like going to caravan over to my house, pick me up. And then we were just going to drive to Milwaukee. And I just remember being at my mom's house and getting a phone call from you, and it's like, where the fuck is he? I don't know where he is. And then like 5 minutes later, getting a call from Woods saying, where the hell is he? I'm standing in front of this Mexican restaurant, and like coordinating that. But then
good thing you were at your house.
Yeah. So I remember we drove out there on Friday night, slept in our car for like an hour.
Yeah. Sleeping in the car.
And there must have been, I should dig up and see if someone online has a lineup of this, but there must have been like 50 bands playing on like 3 stages. And
I don't doubt it. Yeah.
We were like super sleep deprived. We had this table set up, and John was like completely like, I didn't know what he was just like this. He looked like a coal miner.
Yeah.
He wasn't a metal dude. He wasn't like a nerdy guy. He wasn't like a whatever. He was just like a fucking coal miner.
Yeah.
And he was cool. He was pretty funny. Cool. And we had this table, and I think the deal was there was 3 of us, so like we would kind of rotate out.
Yeah. And
see different bands. And
that was the year that Body Count was there, right? Yeah.
And do you want to explain what happened during Body Count?
Sure. I'll jump ahead. We'll explain what happened to that. Yeah, you and I must have left Woods at the table. I didn't even remember that part of it. And Body Count was playing on one of the smaller stages, if you can imagine. It seems like they'd have been on the big stage, but they weren't. And I don't remember the exact sequence, but at one point the lighting rig, they had just a little shitty lighting rig, and it collapsed down into the crowd. And Body Count's a very famous singer, Ice-T. And for those who don't know, Body Count is not a rap band. They're a hardcore band or a kind of metal band or whatever. But Ice-T just commanded the crowd to push the lighting rig back up into place.
Yeah.
Which they did. It was crazy. And you and I were standing back far enough away from the stage that we were in no danger from the rig. And at some point, Ice-T said that the PMRC and Tipper Gore in particular, I believe, could suck his dick, at which time he whipped out his dick to show everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, this is my claim to fame. This is my connection to Law and Order.
Yeah,
is that I've seen Ice-T's dick in person.
Yeah. Now, I will say we were really far away from it, okay? So we're getting a close shot. But the people in the first couple rows, those guys saw it way closer than anybody should.
Yeah, but we could see it from there. Props to Ice-T. We
could see it from there. In fact, I remember thinking, what the hell is the... Oh, my God!
Yeah. And so is that. The other distinct memory that I had was Cannibal Corpse was one of the big bands.
Yep.
And one is, we had quote unquote backstage passes or whatever, because we were vendors.
Yeah.
So, but there was no like backstage really. No. You just wandering around. This place was an old Eagles Lodge in Milwaukee, which it's still around. They still do shows there. But I remember going up to, this was when Chris Barnes was still singing for Cannibal Corpse. It was right after Tomb of the Mutilated came out. I remember going up to Chris Barnes backstage right before then, and I swear that he must have like just smoked crack.
Probably.
Maybe he was doing something else, but he was just like incoherent, and then ran out there, ran on stage. And that's also, I remember there must have been probably, I don't know, that was the big stage, and there's probably a couple thousand people.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was just a mosh pit. Like, it was the biggest fucking mosh pit I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. That was, I don't even know how to describe it.
And the other thing, to jump ahead a little, was the one thing I remembered too.
The drive back.
Oh yeah. Well, actually, as an aside, the where that Eagles Lodge is, it's kind of funny because I was in Milwaukee. Well, I go back almost every year. My wife is from there. But we stayed at a hotel, and I went outside to go get something to eat or whatever to walk. And and then I realized, because I don't know Milwaukee that well, the layout or whatever. And I walked outside and I walked a block and I realized, oh shit, I'm right in front of where that was.
Yeah.
And then
you sent me a picture of that.
Yeah. And then I realized, oh wait, there's that store that we went to get fucking Gatorades at 10 times. And
yes.
And it's also like 2 blocks from where Jeffrey Dahmer did his work.
I guess I didn't realize it was that close, although I did know some people who made a pilgrimage over to his apartment.
Yeah. Like the guys from Macabre have a bunch of band photos from.
Yeah.
And so the drive back was.
Oh my God, the drive back.
I think our plan was we were going to get a hotel.
Do we have another hour for the drive back?
Well, just to summarize, one was we were going to we had been awake for 48 hours at this point or whatever.
At least.
And we were originally going to okay, we'll just find a place in Milwaukee and get a hotel
just so people understand, we weren't driving back with John Woods. He had someplace else to go.
Yeah, he drove by.
And we had driven separately on the way there. So he went on to whatever the next stop was for him, and we were just driving back to Elkhart. Yeah,
and
trying to.
We didn't stop in Milwaukee for whatever reason, and we were like,
the Grateful Dead were there the same. They were either there or they were in Chicago or something. It was
Chicago.
So everything was sold out.
Yeah, because we were going to go to. We were like, okay, we'll stop in Chicago, and we'd stayed in Chicago a couple times that summer for shows or whatever. But I think we stopped in multiple hotel rooms and they were like, yeah, we're out.
Yeah, we stopped everywhere we could see. From basically Milwaukee to Michigan City. The last place we stopped to try to get a hotel room was in Michigan City. And when we finally made it all the way back to your mom's house, how long? I was asleep so long that your mom came in to check on me. I think she thought I might have been dead.
Yeah, and I'm like hallucinating. And by the time we got to Michigan City, it was like almost daylight out.
It was daylight out by the time.
And I remember we were driving on the toll road, and both of us just fell asleep.
Yeah, I was about dead, and I think you were asleep, and I woke you up, and I said, dude, you've got to drive for a little while. And you were like, yeah, man, I can do it, no problem. And so we switched, and I remember just hearing this crazy rattling, kind of bumping, crazy sound or whatever, and we're just starting to go up this hill, and we're off the side of the road on the rumble patch, on the side or whatever, and it's shaking the fuck out of the car. And I looked up, and the entire windshield and the side windows were completely fogged over. You couldn't see anything out of them at all. We're doing about 7 miles an hour going up this hill, and you were completely asleep, completely gone. And I just freaked the fuck. I'm like, wake up, John, wake up. What the fuck, man? I probably shook your arm. I don't know what I did. And you woke up, you're like, whoa, what the fuck? And pulled over real quick. And I don't remember. We probably got out and walked around for a minute just to try to wake up. And man, that was bad. I'm surprised we lived through that.
Yeah. So, so that was Milwaukee. And that summer was, that's
the highlights of Milwaukee. We could do a whole show just about that one.
Yeah.
That one thing.
And so I just wanted to skip ahead a little bit here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the other thing, there were 2 things that you got involved with kind of after this. One was at a certain point, the internet kind of took over. Mm-hmm. And I know you did print episode or issues pretty much all through the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. The last print was probably 2000 or something.
Yeah, and by then it was color cover. You were including a CD for a couple of them.
The last 3 issues I think had CDs.
Yeah, and by that point, when did you start? Well, I know you started Cursed Productions, which was kind of your record label / distro. But
Yeah.
I seem to remember you started it in like maybe 93, 94?
93. Yeah, I'm sure it was 93. And the idea is that Metal Curse was really, really expensive and really time consuming. And I never got enough ads to pay for it. But I mean, especially at that time, I had nowhere close to enough ads to pay for the printing.
Yeah.
And no other way to do it. So I forget I had talked to some other people about it and some other guys who had small labels and stuff. And they said, oh, well, there's a lot of bands out there that need support, and maybe you could just, do a couple releases here and there, like a 7-inch vinyl record, or something like that. And then that would sell, and you could use that money to get the zine printed. And I thought that was a pretty good idea. And I really, at the time, really, really liked a band called Pax Mortis from California. And just the super coolest guys, the super fucking coolest guys who have ever lived.
Yeah.
All of them. And tremendous band, just unbelievable level of musicianship, quality songwriting, just amazing, just in every category, amazing. And I don't know, we just really hit it off. And I said, and I really liked their demos. And I said, do you guys want to maybe do a 7-inch with me, a 7-inch record? And they agreed to it. And that was, like I was talking before about Richard C., that was just a handshake deal. I just had a handshake deal with almost all the bands I ever worked with. And so I eventually got the master tape from them, which they sent me on a regular analog cassette. I had to have transferred over. So that was surprising to see that cassette at the time. But we got a 7-inch made for Pax Mortis, and it was really expensive. It was really crazy expensive. I forget how much it was, but the 7-inch record that I sold at the time for $5 cost somewhat more to manufacture than a CD would have at the time. And that's when, in the early 90s, these kind of underground CDs weren't selling for like $10 or some bullshit like that. I mean, I'd see flyers where CDs were like $25, or $22, or $27, or $30 even in some, not very many cases, but I mean some. And to backtrack a little bit, that was one of the reasons why I jumped on that Rotting Christ flyer that I saw at your apartment a million years ago, because their CD Passage to Arcturo was $7, postage paid, from Greece.
Yeah, and that's like the cost of postage. Like, I remember when we were looking at this, we were like, this has got to be a joke. This can't be like the real.
Yeah, I thought it was maybe a typo, and it was at least $17 or something like that, but it wasn't. I sent them $7 cash, and they sent me that CD back, and my brain exploded. It was the best thing I ever heard.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to Pax Mortis. So we got this CD, or pardon me, we got the 7-inch manufactured, and I tried to really go all out on it. It's red vinyl instead of black vinyl, which is a little bit more expensive. And, it's got a nice cover that I had printed somewhat locally in South Bend, as we said, about a half hour away from here. And had a sticker with it and a little info sheet and some other shit like that. And it was just so expensive, and the records were so fragile that I just thought, okay, this is insane. It would cost less to manufacture a CD, and they're easier to mail, and everything about them is easier, and you can sell it for 3 times as much.
Yeah.
So I just never did another vinyl record after that. And oddly enough, this does kind of tie into Rotting Christ, because once I got that CD from them, I looked a little bit more into some other Greek bands, and one of those bands was Verathron.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was my all-time best seller. I made a deal with them to re-release a couple of their demos that they had done on CD with some bonus tracks, and that was by far the biggest selling thing ever on my label.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the list of the stuff you did. I mean, obviously you did the Adversary stuff.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of other Psychomancers, Sea of Tranquility, Avernus.
Yeah, Avernus. Oh my God, those guys are so awesome.
Deceased. And And so, like, to kind of trail off into this, I mean, you were on the internet. I mean, you had Cursed Productions on the internet pretty early.
Not early enough. You know, if I'd have been there just a minute earlier, maybe I could have just gotten cursed.com instead of cursedproductions.com. I always really regretted that.
Yeah, but you were
other things.
You had a shopping cart system, and you had a credit card machine, and you had all that stuff. And that's still the site is still going, so all of our listeners can go to cursedproductions.com and buy everything.
Yeah, if you want some shit you've never heard of, that's the place to go.
Yeah, so it's what I think is interesting now is death metal, you know, had that big peak in 92, and then it kind of fell away and went into different directions. And it seems like since then, in the 25 years, oh, Jesus Christ.
Don't get me started, John.
But there were, because I remember when I was in Seattle at some point, 97, 98 or something like that, like I was helping you out doing mail for you.
Yep.
And then it was like, it was picking up again. Like like there was like, and then it was like, oh, the 92 stuff is like the old school or the classic.
Right.
And this is like kind of the new wave of, you know, there were some bands like Dismember, Unleashed and stuff that were kind of going back to their roots or whatever. And, you know, doing cool stuff. But it seems like it kind of repeats itself. And obviously the technology has changed. I mean, metalcurse.com is, you know, all online. Everybody is, I know now if you are on the list for a record label, they're just either going to give you like MP3s or just like a link to listen to the shit online somewhere.
Typically almost always they send you a link and then you can download it. So it's just a direct link to different lists. The smaller labels have a direct link to, like, let's say a Dropbox link or something like that. Yeah. And it's just got MP3 files in there, all zipped together into one archive typically. And the bigger labels either have their own system, which is how Century Media does it. They do it all in-house. And a lot of the other labels, kind of the next level smaller than that, have a thing that I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. I've never heard anybody say it out loud. I think it's Holix or something like that. And it's just a website that houses all these MP3s for them. So you just click through the link in the email and it takes you to this site and it shows you, you know, you've got all these promo links available. Do you want to download this one? Or you can just click right through to the very one from the email and download it real fast. But
what's interesting about that is, I mean, at least to me, there's a big loss in not going to a record store. Even like where you're talking about when you worked at the store and Jack would come in and you talk to him or whatever, or when we would talk to these guys like Frank or whatever. But it seems like there's a slight amount of that coming back to some extent. Like one is, it seems like there's a lot of people buying up old shit on eBay.
There are some,
Like if you still had that, Combat Records Poison CD or cassette that you threw, it's somewhere on US 33 or something. But I'm sure if you threw that on eBay now, I mean, you know, you'd get hundreds of bucks for it.
There are some old death metal or other kind of metal CDs that bring a lot of money on eBay, more than you would think, hundreds of dollars. I don't know.
Which is weird because, I mean, if you're going to listen to, and I don't know, this is kind of something like my mom would say or something, but I mean, if you're going to listen to the music and you just bought the MP3s on iTunes, it's probably the same or even better. I mean, some of those albums get re-released and remastered, but
but I'm talking about stuff that's not probably ever going to get re-released and not on iTunes. And I'm not saying that a person, if one felt like it, probably could not find some type of a download, but it wouldn't be unofficial one. It definitely, this type of stuff is not on iTunes. But some things, I mean, you know, I sell some things on eBay, some CDs and whatnot, and I had a Typo Negative promo CD that sold for I forget how much it was. I told you about it at the time and we were just amazed how much. I forget, it was like $300 or something. it didn't have any unreleased songs on it. It wasn't, I mean, Pete Steele didn't sign it with his jizz or anything, which would be a real Pete Steele thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, those promos,
just,
they didn't even have liner notes or anything. A lot of times they would just have a J card that would maybe have the list of songs on it.
Yeah.
And that's it. And the tapes were just like clear with a white sticker on it or something. Sometimes they were sometimes they were silk screened. And every once in a while, one of those would be different. Like one of them, I remember there was, God, what is the band? Anacrusis. Do you remember those guys?
Yep, sure do.
They had that album Screams and Whispers, which I actually liked a lot. It's kind of more prog rock sounding than metal, but they had a demo, or not a demo of it, but they had the label sent out one like 6 months before the album came out, and then they sent out another one, but the first one was actually like mastered completely different.
Yep, they used to do that sometimes.
But still, I mean, it's funny because like we used to just have piles of that shit and just,
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was the thing about it, is that on the one hand, the MP3 links, kind of hate it. But on the other hand, I don't have to have a million tapes laying around or a million CDs laying around, which I have a million CDs laying around anyway.
Yeah, your house is a bit extreme.
It's insane.
Yeah,
it's crazy. So I mean, I don't know. There's some good and some bad. If they say, "Oh, here's this," this band's working on this new album or whatever, they could just post a rough mix of it, and you could listen to it right now, and it wouldn't be a month from now when they send you a CDR or whatever.
Yeah, and so just to kind of wrap up, I'm curious myself, because I don't keep up with. I mean, I can't keep up with anything anymore, but I'm just curious what bands you're listening to now that are either things that we used to listen to that are still around, or are kind of new, who's on the forefront now.
Yeah, I don't even know who's on the forefront now. I get so much new stuff to listen to. It's just kind of hard to keep up with everything, which I guess sounds weird, but I mean, there's just so much. There's a lot of time involved with just downloading something, and I get, I don't know, a dozen promos every day probably.
Yeah.
And in the old days when I got physical promo things, I always told all the record labels, I'll review everything. If you send it, I'll review it. That seemed kind of fair if they were going to take the time and the money and sacrifice an actual copy of something, especially for a smaller band. If they're going to send it to me, I should really review it and write a review. And I had to just change that in more recent, well, not more recent times anymore. I mean, I changed it a million years ago, but so I don't review everything now because it would just be impossible. I mean, I'd probably have to do 100 reviews a week.
Yeah, it's really amazing how, I mean, the internet is kind of democratized. Not only the internet, but I mean, anybody can get Pro Tools. Anybody can, just plug their shit into their laptop and record something way better than the best bands in the 90s sounded like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just going to mention that the best sounding albums, like we're talking about from the early 90s or mid 90s, don't even measure up to just a demo recording now.
Yeah.
Really. Like you said, everybody can get, well, they're doing everything in Pro Tools or however they're doing it. And it's just the barrier to entry is low. You can go get a computer and get a little equipment and you're doing it.
Yeah.
Now, trying to record certain things, I mean, still trying to get a good drum sound, I'd imagine is a little tricky and whatnot. But as far as the guitars and vocals and that sort of thing would be pretty easy.
Yeah.
I mean, easier anyway.
I mean, it's amazing because, I mean, I fucked around on the bass for a couple of years in college and then kind of put it aside. And a couple of years ago, I kind of came back and had to basically relearn everything from scratch. But even that is like, I mean, everything is, if you want to learn an instrument, you just go to YouTube and say like, how do I play this solo? There's all the lessons. There's all the tab and all that stuff. You can just get online for free. And the sound of it, I mean, I have a cable that goes into my computer, and then I fire up Bias FX or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I just can instantly say, okay, I want, whatever. I want Yngwie Malmsteen's tone from his first album. Click, done. And you've got it. And it sounds, better than if you, well, it's arguable, but it sounds just as good as if you went out and bought thousands of dollars of Marshall amps. And
right. Well, and we got a little sidetracked when I was talking about Adversary, but to tie that into what we're saying right now, if I've got a minute, after a while, Ed had to leave. He moved and got married and had to leave the band, and we got Jack and I got together with our old friend Bob Burns, and so we had an actual real live drummer for a while, but then we couldn't do any of the samples live and everything, so that kind of changed our sound a lot, and we recorded another EP and an album with Bob before whatever happened with him happened, and he just kind of disappeared. And that was a long time ago. And then a couple of years ago, Jack and I got together with Ed, actually at my wedding, and Ed's wife suggested that we should reform the band since, it was original guys there. And I was just heartbroken. I didn't really know that Jack's carpal tunnel was so bad that he couldn't play guitar at all.
Yeah.
And so we didn't really even talk about it for a while, but in somewhat more recent times, in the last year or the last several months or whatever, Ed and I have been talking about it, and Ed's got a lot of technology to record, and he's recorded some other type of albums, some more electronic sort of albums, or industrial, I guess, since then. And, and he said, well, if we can get some new songs ready, and I have been working on some new songs, we could just go to his place. And he's, I don't remember how far, an hour and a half away in Lafayette, Indiana.
Yeah.
And like you were just saying about Yngwie Malmsteen, he said, we could just plug the guitars right in. I'll dial up whatever sound you want. If you want it to sound like Sunlight Studios, I've got it right here. If you want it to sound like Morrisound, we can do that. Whatever guitar tone you want, can just plug it in and dial it up.
Yeah.
Which blows my mind, because it used to take so long to try to figure, we'd go into the studio and try to figure out exactly what we were doing and exactly how we wanted it to sound. And now if I could ever get everything sorted out.
Yeah. Well, that's cool though. I mean, it's, and Ed is an interesting guy too, because he has this whole other life as a computer programmer. Mm-hmm. And he's done all kinds of,
Ed's done a lot of cool stuff, and he's actually, been going all over the country giving talks about, the name of his talk is I think it's called Outsourcing Mental Illness. I hope I got that right. I apologize if that's not quite right. And it just started out as a speech or a talk he gave once, and it just has gotten more and more and more popular since then. So he's been doing a lot of nonprofit work with that to try to help people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I remember, I think he wrote a big article about it too, just about the whole concept of like depression in like tech people, basically. Yep. And he's, cause I've looked at his blog and, now and again, and he writes a lot about like open source software and development paradigms and stuff like that. Yeah. So it's interesting to see that, he's got that second life, but it's also sounds pretty cool that you guys are still kind of scheming about how to do this. And it's interesting too, because now, I mean, like me and you, we've got this technology where we're talking, but we're 2,500 miles apart. But so who knows what'll happen? So
yeah, and I'm really excited about it, and I hope that we can get it done, because this as a writer, when you've got something in you that needs to come out, you might just sit there and type and type and type and type and type, and all of a sudden, you're like, oh, my goal today was however many words, and I've just done 3 times that many or twice that many or something, and there's just some story in you that needs to come out. And I feel that way about writing songs. I wish I could kind of run them all by Jack, as I was talking about before, to just get his ear on them.
Yeah,
we'll probably do that at some point, because he would just be so helpful with that. But it's once you have that in there and it just needs to come out, it has to. I think that kind of has to happen in some capacity. So I've got to do something with these ideas I've got.
Well, if you need somebody to scream some background lyrics about nuclear winter style, like fuck your dentist or whatever. Yeah, I can just Skype in.
That'd be good. Yeah, I'm sure we're good. Yeah, I mean, anti-dentist song, of course.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, on that note. Cool. Okay, well, thanks for talking.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. Catch you later.
All right.